Okay, glad you tuned in. Apologize for being a little bit late. We're having Zoom problems and some technical problems, as they say in the big time. This is Starlight Church, and we are going to open up the book of Romans this morning, chapter 8. If you have a Bible, go ahead and turn to Romans chapter 8, verse 29. Most of you probably thought I was going to say Romans 8:28 at the beginning there, but no, we're going to pop down one verse here. Romans 8:29. It says, for whom he did foreknow, this is referring to God here, for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. So for whom he did foreknow, then he did predestinate. Predestinate to what? To be conformed to the image of his Son. At the end of the day, when God is all done with everything he intended and planned to do for your life, the end result will be that you will be conformed to the image of his Son. But we're all different. I mean, there's one Jesus, so there's one ultimate goal. There's one ideal. There's one perfection as such. And so how does God get all of us? You know, right now there's almost 8 billion people on this earth, most of which admittedly are not saved. So God is not conforming them to the image of his Son. He's talking about saved people, born again people. But say it's 10%. That's 800 million people. How does he get 800 million different people all to be conformed to the image of his Son? That's a monumental task when you think about it. Because every one of us are different, and we're different at such a level that is inconceivable. I mean, our IQs are different, our tastes are different, our goals are different. Our emotional makeup is different. Everything about us, our level of resistance to temptation, our proclivity to sin, it's all different. There's not one of us that are basically even remotely the same in all that. And so look at the task that God has before him, to juggle all these trillions of pieces and make sense out of it. It really is incredible when you think about it. So how does God move us along from point A, us as such, to point B, which is the image of his Son? How does he do that? Well, obviously, your journey is going to be different than my journey because you're different than I am. I'm different than you are. So the things that God has to do in your life to get you from point A to point B are going to be different than the things God's going to have to do in my life to get me from point A to point B. And for a lot of us, this is where the wheels fall off immediately, because the way humans are hardwired is that we spend so much time looking at each other, critiquing each other, or trying to emulate each other, or wanting to be like each other, that it gets all screwed up in the process. So if I look at your lifestyle and I think, man, you've really got it going on, You got all your ducks in a row. Boy, I wish I could be more like you. There's things in your life that you might be dissatisfied with. There's things in your life that you had to endure that you don't want to endure. There's things that you are going through that you wish you could avoid totally. So you look at my life and you see certain aspects of me that you say, man, oh man, I wish I could be like that. And so we're all at cross points, cross purposes, looking at each other, comparing ourselves with each other, judging our progress on the basis of how we view each other. And it gets into a great big muddled, fuddled mess because we're all using the wrong ruler or the wrong yardstick to try to judge where we are in this process from going from point A to point B. You know, I might look at somebody with $1 million or so and think, man, oh man, I wish I could be like that. Well, what would $1 million in my life do to me? It's going to bring out certain aspects of life that maybe God doesn't want in my life. Maybe I'll have access or options that God doesn't want me to have to confront. So he's not going to give me $1 million. Somebody else, they can get that $1 million and they're not necessarily tempted with the same temptations I'll be tempted with. They can handle it. And so God will give them money. No harm, no foul. Now, they might not do the right thing with it. They might get screwed up, but every one of us are different. So our paths are different. The end result is going to be the same, to be conformed to the image of his Son, the Lord Jesus. As God moves in us, what do we generally do? For God to move us down that road a little bit closer and a little bit closer, it's not all one swoop. I'm almost 79 years old, almost. Look at all the days that God has had to work with me. Some of you are just in your early 20s. Maybe you've been saved just a short little time. And God has, had shorter time to work in your life than he's had to work in my life. But all of us, to some extent or another, we go through this process of being moved along by God by kicking, screaming, resisting, giving into sin, giving into temptation. Sometimes we ignore God. And sometimes God just has to deal with us as all these things come up. You sin a little bit, God will deal appropriately with you. If you really blow it, God has to deal appropriately with that too. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. So you can't look at a verse like Romans 8:28, which says all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose, and then run out and sin indiscriminately and saying, well, all things work together for good. You can't convolute that verse into that type of a meaning. So if you're living in sin right now, or you're thinking about sin right now, or you're wishing you could do this right now, and then your fallback or your safety net is going to be Romans 8:28, all things work together for good, you're in for a mighty big shock. From God's perspective, it'll work out for good. But you're going to have to go through hell, basically, to get to that other side. God is not mocked. So, in our view of life, we see things basically, from a fairy tale perspective. Some of us are on top of this. We have a plan, we have a goal, we have an agenda, And we have a set of boxes that we're going to check off. Well, I got the job that I wanted, I got the promotion that I needed. I'm in the career that I want, got my home, got my wife, got my 2.1 kids, got the dog, got the picket fence. And we just go through and we check these things off and we think we're doing pretty good. Or we sit there on the other hand and we moan and groan and complain that we don't have this or don't have that because we're looking at the guy across the street who does maybe have these things. And so we say, well, how come I can't have my picket fence? How come I can't have my 2.1 kids? And how come I can't have a dog? How come he gets this and I don't? And we're dissatisfied, we're disgruntled, we're PO'd. And we view God as, oh, well, God likes him better than he likes me. No, it takes this much to get the guy across the street from point A to point B. It might take you this much for God to get you from point A to point B. So the whole purpose of this preamble, as it were, to this thing is don't look at everybody else and judge yourself in your standing with God based on somebody else. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It's like, two raindrops talking with each other and arguing about who's the wettest. Raindrop A says to raindrop B, well, I'm wetter than you are. And raindrop B says, no, you're not. And the fight is on. I mean, it's stupid. It's ludicrous. And that's what we do. We spend so much time looking at other people, judging other people, envying other people. And at the end of the day, the only thing that counts is, from God's perspective, is that we are going to be conformed to the image of his Son. And God will make you kicking and screaming. You can ignore him. You can pretend he doesn't exist. You can do whatever you want. He's going to get you there one way or another. You can do it the easy way, or you can do it the hard way. It's up to you. So God sees things as they are. We tend to see things as we wish they were. We're very good at it. But God sees it differently. He sees things as they are. God is always working behind the scenes. Always. Sometimes, and this is the confusing thing to a lot of people, sometimes God will use bad things to move us along that line. He will use Satan to move us from point A to point B. And we get really, really confused when that kind of stuff happens. Look at Job. You remember the story? We talk about Job all the time. The things that happened to Job. Do you really think that Job sat there and reasoned within himself, oh, God is conforming me to the image of his Son? I don't think Job had a clue about that concept. Do you think as Job was going through the hell that he was going through, that he said to himself, you know what? This is the hand of God moving me from point A to point B. I don't think he had a concept about that either. Job is reacting to circumstances. Job is bitching and griping to God about, why are you putting me through this? He's bitching and griping to God about, why are you picking on me? He's in God's face constantly for 38 chapters. So Job had no concept about being conformed to the image of his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Sometimes we do not recognize the means by which God moves in our lives. And a lot of the time, God will use negative things. He will use bad things. He will use evil things. And sometimes he'll use good things. But we get so confused when sickness comes or disease comes, or, God forbid you get, in a wreck and you're paraplegic for the next 40 years of your life, or a poor little kid who gets burned and has to live with that pain and that disfigurement for the rest of his life. Do you really truly think that for the most part, people in those circumstances see the hand of God working? There are some that do, but it's the exception rather than the rule. So when bad things happen to us, we get bent out of shape because we think that God is mad at us, that God is dissatisfied with us, God is punishing us. And maybe we have done something that God is punishing us for, but it's not punishment for punishment's sake. It's punishment to move us along from point A to point B. We have a whole different set of criteria when it comes to punishment. You cross me, boom, I'll get you back. You hurt me, boom, I'll hurt you worse if I can. You do something bad to me, I'll do something bad to you. This is our frame of reference when it comes to somebody doing what we perceive as bad. God doesn't see it like that from his perspective. So for him to use a bad thing to incorporate something good in our lives, he sees no conflict in that. Because the end result is not to punish us for punishment's sake. The end result is to conform us to the image of his son. That's his motive. And he'll use whatever means he has to. And unfortunately, because there's so many people, he has to use different means for different people at different times. He doesn't work on me the same way now that he did when I was 20, 22, 25 years old. It's an entirely different scenario now. And I'd venture to say that, 10 years from now, whatever your state in life is, that if we're still around here and we're still functioning, that God will use different means in your life than he's using now. God does not have to explain himself. If Job knew, you remember the discussion between God and Job? God and Satan. Satan comes to God, he asks permission to do this to Job. God says, okay, boom. Poor old Job is toast for a while. Now, had 15 minutes later, God come down to Job and he said, Job, listen, me and Satan, we had a discussion. We've got basically a bet going on here between the two of us. I say, we're going to get you through this thing. Satan says, now, if I do these things, you are going to curse him to my face. Job, I just want you to know up front, you're going to lose your health, you're going to lose your life, your health, your security, you're going to lose your kids, you're going to lose your reputation, you're going to lose your standing, you're going to lose your security, you're going to lose it all. But don't worry about it, because at the end of the day, I'm going to give you twice as much as you had before. Do you think Job would have gone through this experience with a whole different mindset? Of course he would have. If God gives you a disease or allows a disease to come upon you, whether it be cancer, whether it be, just fill in a blank, our first impression is, good grief, why me? How come I get this? How come God doesn't protect me? Why doesn't God take it away? Why do I have to endure this? Why do I have to go through this? And then drag my family with me along this journey. How come? Why? God never sits down face to face and tell you, oh, hey, I'm giving you cancer. And you've got 2 years, 3 years, 6 months, whatever to live. But don't worry about it, because at the end of the day, it's all okay. You'll have to endure the chemo, you'll have to endure the, all the things that go with it. But don't worry about it. I'm with you. He doesn't say that in that sense. It's all through the Bible, though. He is telling us that indirectly. But he doesn't sit down and explain himself. He's God. He doesn't have to explain himself. He doesn't have to justify himself. He doesn't have to tell us what he's doing. He's already told us what we're doing. He's conforming us to the image of his son. And whatever we have to go through to get from point A to point B, we've got to go through it, period. He's not going to stop every single time and say, oh, gee whiz, here's another setback, but don't worry about it because it's all in my master plan to get you from point A to point B. Now, he laid it out once for us. That's it. Hang on for the ride. He doesn't always let us in on the secret. He doesn't necessarily tell us, when you get cancer, it's for this or that. He doesn't tell us, well, if you get in a wreck and you get, mutilated or, dismembered or hurt or something, don't worry about it because of this or that. He doesn't have to explain himself. He doesn't justify himself. He doesn't let us in on it. We have to take it by faith because he's already told us all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. He's already told us, I will never leave you nor forsake you. He's given us promises so that now on the day-to-day things as they happen, he doesn't have to sit down again and reinforce what he's already said. He's already put it down there for us. It's up for us to find it and use it and memorize it and believe it. Some examples. Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50. You remember the story? And I've used this illustration before, but it's so good, I can't help it. Joseph. Joseph chapter 50, you remember the things that Joseph had to endure. His brothers hated him. He was the pet, the chosen one of his mom and dad. He was spoiled rotten, could do no wrong, the golden child, the favored one. And because of that, his brothers hated his guts. And so certain things came into the life of Joseph. Look what it says in verse 50. Verse 20, I'm sorry. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. But as for you, he's talking to his brothers now, after he'd gone through this whole rigmarole. They're at the tail end. Everything's been done. Everything's over. He's now explaining it from his standpoint. He says, but as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good. This is what I've been trying to say for the last, half hour or so. We perceive things in one way, God perceives them in another way. He wants to conform us to the image of his son. And so sometimes he'll use bad things or bad means or bad entities to bring about these changes in our lives. We don't like it. We hate it. So how did this manifest itself? Ye meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Well, what does that mean? Well, his whole life, up until when he was 17, 18 years old. As I said, he was the favorite, he was spoiled, and his brothers hated his guts, literally. They picked on him, they bullied him, they ostracized him, they never let him in to the group, as it were. He was always an outsider, an outcast. They hated him. Ye meant it for evil, he said, but God meant it for good. God meant it for good? You mean hating my guts, picking on me, bullying me? God meant it for good? Yeah. Why? Because he's trying to move him from point A to point B. And the way that he had to do it in this case was to use these bad elements, as it were, these negative elements to come into Joseph's life to move him along. Ye meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. How did that finally play out? Number one, they hated his guts so much that they threw him in a pit overnight. He's crying and caterwauling and pleading and begging and so forth. They couldn't care less. They sell him into slavery. He's taken down into Egypt, thrown in a jail cell, gets out of jail as a household slave. He's accused of rape. He gets thrown back in prison again. And all the while, God meant it for good? Now, take it into your life, whatever negative type things you're going through, as much as you might dislike it, as much as you might get frustrated by it, as much as the anguish and the hurt and the heartache and the confusion is, God meant it for good. So that you can be transformed into the image of his son. Genesis chapter 45. Turn back a few pages here. Genesis 45. Verse 5. Still Joseph, still his brothers, still discussing here. Now, therefore, be not grieved, he's talking to his brothers, nor angry with yourselves for all the things they did, that ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. That sounds like a great thing. God sent me before you or ahead of you so that I could preserve your life. It's a great thing. But what were the mechanics of that? As I just said a second ago, they sold him into slavery. He ends up in jail. He's accused of rape. He gets thrown back in jail again, and he languishes there for years. God meant it for good. God sent me before you so that I could preserve you. We don't always figure out God's reasoning and God's ways. It all comes down to a matter of trust and faith. So God has an end game. Each of us, to get from point A to point B, have to go through certain things, as I said before, because we're different. different interests, different tastes, different talent, different everything. So God has to work differently in each of our lives. You remember, how can you forget, because I keep mentioning it almost every message, Paul. You remember in Acts chapter 9, how it says that God said, referring to Paul, he is a chosen vessel unto me. I will show him what great things he must suffer. An oxymoron, if there ever was an oxymoron. God knew that in Paul's case, the move from point A to point B was monumental. I mean, some people are saved, when they're 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old. They're still sinners, obviously, but they haven't had that lifetime of really, really degenerate type sin. Paul did. I mean, Paul was so bad that he actually, literally, physically, personally had people killed, Christians, separated families, left little kids orphaned or destitute because he's killing their moms and dads. So in Paul's case, God had to use the extreme to get his attention. He's a chosen vessel, that's great, but he's such a lousy vessel, I'm going to show him what great things he must suffer. Now, in your case, God might not have to go to that same extreme. The whippings, the beatings, the jail time, the ostracized from, friends, the desertion of those who he thought he could trust, stoning, thrown into the wild animals there in the amphitheaters. God might not have to go to that extreme with you, but he's going to have to do something. It's all relative. You sin a lot, God's going to have to work a lot. Yeah, you sin so-so, God might just have to work so-so. Each one of us are different. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy 8. In Deuteronomy 8, take a look at verse 2. Deuteronomy 8:2. And thou shalt remember all the ways which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness. Why did he lead him 40 years in the wilderness? To humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no. God will put you through certain things that he can humble you. He will put you through certain things that he can prove you. Not that he doesn't know up front. Obviously, he knows, but he wants you to know. Moses, 40 years as the son of Pharaoh, living in the palace of Egypt. 40 years at the backside of the desert, just him and his little family. 40 years out there. So that God could train him, so that God could educate him, so that God could pretty well undo the first 40 years of his life so that he could be usable for the last 40 years of his life. So Moses' life is divided into 3 parts. The 40 years living as a prince of Egypt. His dad is Pharaoh. 40 years in the backside of the desert. and then 40 years leading the children of Israel. What does God have to do in your life to get you to that point that you can be useful? It took 80 years in the case of Moses. 80 years before God said, you're ready to lead my people. David, approximately 15 years, running, hiding, feigning madness, doing anything he could to survive the wrath of Saul before God was ready, or no, before David was ready, as it were, to be of service to God as king of Israel. 15 years. 15 years after God had already proclaimed him king and anointed him. From that point, it took 15 years for David to finally get it. Noah, 120 years building that ark. As we mentioned last week, 120 years of ridicule, 120 years of doing without on a personal thing. He's not investing in his future in that sense. He's not amassing great wealth for him and his family. He's not making a reputation solely because he's a great guy. He is suffering humiliation. He's suffering ridicule, everything else for a 120-year period. He didn't know the concept of a flood. He didn't know what God was going to do in that sense. But it took God 120 years working on this guy. So Romans chapter 8, verse 29 told us that God is conforming us to the image of his dear son. Psalm 17, we'll close with this. Psalm 17. So God has predestined us to be conformed to the image of his son. That's the purpose of everything that you go through life in: the good, the bad, the ugly, the indifferent, the ecstasy, the downfall, the humiliation, the sin, everything. All things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose, because he's got one goal only: to conform you to the image of his dear son. Psalm 17, verse 15. As for me, I will behold thy face in righteousness. I shall be satisfied when I awake with thy likeness. David got it. That's God's whole purpose in a nutshell. Conform to the image of his son. David says, hey, I'm satisfied. I'll be happy when I awake in thy likeness. Heavenly Father, sometimes we get so angry with you. We get so frustrated with you. We get so mad that you don't answer prayer the way we think you should, that you don't give us the things that we think you should, that you don't do for us the things that we think you should. And sometimes that bitterness or that anger or that disappointment or that confusion can just overpower us. And sometimes we get so discouraged that we might not even come to you in prayer. We might not even bother to read our Bible or to think of spiritual things because we've been disappointed because you didn't give us what we wanted in prayer. And it's a real narrow edge that we walk on. On one hand, we're told to ask for things that we want. On the other hand, we're told that, well, if we're not careful, we ask for things that we shouldn't ask for, and you're going to tell us no. And in the process, we tend to get confused. And so, Father, my prayer today for us, for me, for anyone listening to the sound of my voice, help us to focus on one thing and one thing only, not our needs, our desires, our wants, the frivolous things that we deem important at the time. But Lord, help us to keep in mind that you have one goal for us. Real simple from your standpoint, one goal: to conform us to the image of your dear Son. And unfortunately, for some of us, that conforming will hurt. It will be unpleasant. It will be continuous. It will last for years. And you won't let us in on the joke. We won't understand why bad things happen to us. We won't understand why we are forced to endure certain things. We won't understand, or we get mad, or we get upset, or we pout when things don't go our way. And all the while, you are working constantly to get us from point A to point B. We don't appreciate it. We don't understand it. We don't even care about it most of the time. All we want is what we want when we want it. That's it. That's life from our standpoint. But Father, my prayer is that you would bless each and every one of us in the sense that we can understand conceptually in our heart of hearts that even the bad things that happen to us are for our own good. You can take every negative thing that happens in our lives, you can turn it into something good. We just have to trust you. And that's the hardest thing that you could possibly ask from us. You know that, is for us to trust you. So Lord, I pray that you would endue us with that extra dose of faith, that we can trust you, that we can say, come what may, come hell or high water, at the end of the day, regardless of my circumstances, regardless of my feelings, regardless of the way I see things, God has a plan working in my life that is for my good, because the ultimate plan is that he conforms me to the image of his dear Son. And I'll let it go at that, and I'll trust him, and I'll rest in him. Father, give us that. I pray in Jesus' name.